He found 6 children at auction. What he did next stunned the whole town. Marshal Silas Brennan pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of Millbrook's town square, dust swirling around the animals' hooves like ghosts seeking rest. The crowd's laughter cut through the afternoon heat, sharp and wrong. He'd ridden 3 days through desert and stone to serve a warrant on a cattle rustler, but the scene before him froze the blood in his veins. 6 children stood on the auction block. The youngest couldn't have been more than 4, her blonde hair matted with dirt, clutching a doll with one arm torn clean off. The oldest boy, maybe 12, kept his chin raised but his hands shook. Between them, for more souls in threadbare clothes and bare feet, lined up like horses at market while grown men called out numbers. $40 for the lot, shouted a man in a stained apron. They're strong enough for field work. 50, came another voice. The girl's pretty enough to serve in the house when she grows. Silas felt his gut twist. He'd seen cruelty in his years wearing the badge. Seen men shot for pocket change and women left to starve in winter. But this cut deeper than violence. This was evil dressed up in daylight respectability. The auctioneer, a thin man with gold teeth, raised his gavel. 50 going once. These fine children need homes, gentlemen. Think of the Christian charity. Christian charity. The words tasted like poison in Silas's mouth. He'd grown up in an orphanage himself, knew the difference between rescue and slavery. These children weren't being saved. They were being sold. He dismounted slow, his boots hitting the wooden planks with deliberate weight. The crowd's attention shifted. Some recognized the star pinned to his vest. Others saw only another bidder. "Hold that gavel," Silas called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. The auctioneer's smile never wavered. "Marshal, you're welcome to bid like any other Christian man. Opening price was $20. I'm not here to bid." Silas stepped closer to the platform, close enough to see the fear in the children's eyes. The youngest girl pressed against the older boy's leg. "I'm here to stop this." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone spat into the dust. The auctioneer's gold teeth caught the sun as his grin stretched wider. "Now Marshal, these children are legally bound for placement. Their previous guardians defaulted on significant debts. The town of Millbrook has every right to recover costs through proper channels." Proper channels. Silas had heard that phrase used to justify every cruelty under heaven. He looked at the children again. The boy met his eyes with desperate hope. The little girl's doll hung by a single thread of fabric, ready to fall apart completely. "What debts?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer would be lies wrapped in legal paper. "Gambling debts, Marshal. Unpaid taxes. The usual failings of weak character." The auctioneer gestured to the crowd. "These good citizens of Millbrook are offering these unfortunate souls a chance at productive lives." Productive lives. The man in the stained apron was eyeing the oldest girl like she was livestock. Another bidder kept checking his pocket watch, impatient to complete his purchase and get back to business. Silas's hand drifted toward his gun. Not to draw it, not yet, but to feel its weight. To remind himself he wasn't powerless here, no matter what the crowd wanted him to believe. "I need to see those debt papers," he said. The auctioneer's smile finally cracked. "Marshal, surely you have more pressing business than questioning the lawful proceedings of, I need to see them now." The crowd pressed closer. Silas counted at least 30 men, maybe more gathering from the saloons and shops. Their faces held the particular hardness of people who'd made peace with profiting from suffering. They'd convinced themselves this was normal. Legal. Even merciful. But the children's eyes told a different story. They spoke of violence and loss, of parents who would never have willingly surrendered them to strangers' mercy. The boy's knuckles were scraped raw. The second girl had a healing cut across her cheek. These weren't children given up by debtors. These were children taken. The auctioneer fumbled with papers from his coat pocket, but Silas wasn't watching him anymore. He was watching the mayor push through the crowd, a heavy man with soft hands and hard eyes. Mayor Cornelius Hatch, according to the warrant papers in Silas's saddlebags. The same man who'd been signing off on suspicious land deals across 3 counties. Marshal Brennan, Mayor Hatch called out, all false warmth and political oil. Welcome to Millbrook. I trust you'll find our little community most accommodating. The way he said accommodating made Silas's skin crawl. This wasn't coincidence. The mayor knew exactly why a federal marshal had ridden into his town today, and he was already working to control the situation. The youngest girl's doll finally fell, hitting the auction block with a soft thud that somehow cut through every voice in the crowd. She reached for it with desperate fingers, but the auctioneer kicked it aside. That was when Silas knew there would be blood before sunset. Silas bent and picked up the fallen doll, its stuffing leaking through torn seams like hope bleeding out of a wound. He handed it back to the little girl, whose fingers closed around it like a drowning person grabbing rope. This auction is finished, he announced, his voice cutting through the afternoon heat. Mayor Hatch stepped forward, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill creeping into the air. Marshal, I appreciate your concern for proper procedure. But these children are under municipal authority. Town sovereignty supersedes, federal law supersedes everything. Silas pulled the warrant from his vest pocket, though it was for cattle rustling, not child trafficking. Sometimes a badge had to stretch to cover the ground between legal and right. I'm investigating reports of unlawful detention and transportation of minors across territorial lines. It wasn't entirely a lie. The children's condition suggested they'd traveled hard miles against their will. Their clothes bore trail dust and their faces carried the hollow look of people who'd seen more than children should ever see. The auctioneer cleared his throat, gold teeth catching sunlight like fool's gold in a creek bed. Marshal, surely you understand these children require proper placement. They cannot simply wander freely without supervision or support. They won't be wandering. Silas stepped onto the auction platform, positioning himself between the children and the crowd. They'll be in federal custody pending investigation. The crowd's murmur turned darker. Someone called out from the back, voice thick with whiskey and anger, since when does the law protect vagrant brats over decent citizens? Since always, Silas thought, but didn't say it. He was counting guns instead. Most men wore sidearms. Some carried rifles. The odds were poor and getting worse as more townsfolk gathered. Mayor Hatch spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness that fooled no one with working eyes. Marshal, be practical. 6 children require food, shelter, medical attention. Our good citizens were prepared to provide all of that. Your federal government offers what, exactly? A jail cell. The older boy spoke for the first time, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. We don't want their charity. Quiet, boy, the auctioneer snapped, raising his hand. Silas caught the man's wrist before it could fall. Touch him and I'll break your arm. The auctioneer pulled back, nursing his wrist and muttering about disrespect for lawful authority. But Silas was watching the mayor's face, reading the calculation there. This wasn't just about recovering debts or placing orphans. This was about control. About a town that had grown comfortable with a particular kind of business, the kind that required looking the other way when wagon trains went missing on empty trails. Show me the debt papers, Silas demanded again. Mayor Hatch nodded to the auctioneer, who produced a leather folder with theatrical reluctance. The papers inside were neat, official, properly witnessed. They documented gambling debts and unpaid taxes totaling nearly $300, signed by one Jonathan Whitmore on behalf of 6 children in his care. They were also dated yesterday. Silas held up the documents so the crowd could see them. Jonathan Whitmore signed these papers yesterday. Tell me, Mayor, when did Mr. Whitmore bring these children to town? I believe it was, let me think. The mayor's pause stretched too long. Early this week. Tuesday, perhaps. And where is Mr. Whitmore now? Departed for California, I understand. Left the children in our care rather than burden them with a difficult journey. The oldest boy made a sound like a strangled laugh. The second girl pressed her face against his shoulder. Their silence spoke louder than any accusation Silas could make. These children look like they've been traveling hard, Silas observed. Clothes torn, faces sunburned, feet cut from walking. Strange condition for children who've been in town all week. The crowd shifted restlessly. Someone near the saloon called out, "Get on with it. We got business to conduct." Mayor Hatch's smile never wavered, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Marshal, I sense you're implying irregularities in our proceedings." "I'd hate for word to reach the territorial governor that federal agents were interfering with lawful municipal business based on unfounded suspicions." The threat was delivered with political smoothness, but it was still a threat. Silas had seen similar corruption before, small towns that had grown too comfortable operating outside federal oversight. They thought distance from civilization meant freedom from consequence. They were usually right. "Where are their parents?" Silas asked the children directly. The oldest boy's jaw worked like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. The little girl clutched her torn doll tighter. None of them answered, but their silence was answer enough. "You see." Mayor Hatch spread his hands again. "Orphaned, abandoned, with no one to care for them but the Christian charity of Millbrook citizens. What more compassionate solution could there be than placement with families who need their labor and can provide guidance?" Labor. The word hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and hard to breathe. Silas looked at the bidders again, saw the hunger in their eyes. This wasn't about charity or guidance. This was about buying workers too young to resist and too powerless to complain. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the town square in shades of blood and gold. Shadows stretched longer, and the crowd grew larger. Silas realized he was no longer looking at 30 men. He was looking at 50, maybe more. And they were all armed. The oldest boy stepped closer to Silas, his voice barely above a whisper. "They killed them. They killed them all and left us for the wolves." Mayor Hatch's smile finally disappeared. "That's quite enough fantasy from traumatized children, Marshal. Surely you understand the tendency of young minds to create dramatic stories when faced with difficult transitions." But Silas was looking at the boy's eyes. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers who'd watched their friends die. In survivors who'd crawled away from massacres. It wasn't fantasy. It was testimony. The church bell tolled 5 o'clock, and somewhere in that bronze voice Silas heard the sound of time running out. Silas made his choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He drew his Colt .45 with practiced speed, the metallic whisper of steel clearing leather cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade through silk. "Children, step behind me. Now." They moved without hesitation, 6 small bodies pressing against his back like sparrows seeking shelter from a hawk. The crowd tensed, hands drifting toward weapons, but no one was quite ready to be the first man to draw on a federal marshal. "Not yet. This is highly irregular, Marshal," Mayor Hatch said, his voice steady but sweat now running freely down his temples. "Threatening lawful citizens in the conduct of municipal business." "I'm not threatening anyone," Silas replied, his gun held low but ready. "I'm protecting federal witnesses in an ongoing investigation. Anyone who interferes will be charged with obstruction." It was thin legal ground, built more on authority than statute, but sometimes thin ground was all a man had to stand on. The crowd knew it too. They were calculating odds, measuring their collective courage against one man's gun and badge. "Walk slow toward the church," Silas murmured to the children without turning around. "Stay close." The old church sat at the far edge of town, its white painted walls weathered gray and its bell tower casting a long shadow across the dusty street. It had been abandoned for 2 years since the new church was built closer to the saloons and shops, but the building was solid stone and timber. More importantly, it had only one door and windows too high for easy access. They moved as a group, Silas walking backward with his gun drawn, the children clustered behind him like a school of fish fleeing deeper water. The crowd followed at a distance, growing larger with each step as word spread through the town. Shopkeepers emerged from doorways. Drinkers spilled out of saloons. Even women appeared at windows, their faces hard with the particular cruelty of those who'd learned to profit from others' misery. "You can't hold federal property in a church, Marshal," someone called out. That's blasphemy." Silas almost smiled at that. In his experience, people who trafficked in children rarely worried much about blasphemy until it became convenient. The church door stood slightly ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Silas pushed it open with his boot, keeping his eyes on the crowd. The interior smelled of dust and neglect, but the walls were thick and the windows defensible. It would do. Inside, quick. The children slipped past him into the shadowed sanctuary. Silas followed, pulling the heavy oak door shut and dropping the iron bar across it. The sound echoed through the empty church like a coffin lid closing. Afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the children's faces in blues and reds and gold. The oldest boy stood protectively in front of the others, his fists clenched despite their trembling. The little girl had sat down in the front pew, cradling her torn doll and humming something too soft to hear. "What's your name, son?" Silas asked the boy. "Marcus Whitmore." The name came out like a challenge, daring anyone to call him a liar. "And your parents?" Marcus's jaw worked for a moment before words came. "Jonathan and Mary Whitmore. They're dead." "Tell me what happened." The boy looked at his siblings, as if asking permission to speak truths too terrible for children to carry. The second oldest girl, maybe 10, nodded slightly. The little one kept humming. "We were traveling to Oregon Territory. Papa had land waiting, inheritance from his brother. 3 families together, safety in numbers." Marcus's voice grew steadier as he spoke, like a wound finally being cleaned. "We camped by Willow Creek, 2 days out from here. Papa and the other men were watering the horses when they came." "Who came?" "Mayor Hatch. 6 or 7 others. Said we were on private land, needed to pay passage fees. Papa showed them our maps, said we had right-of-way through territorial lands. That's when they started shooting." Outside, the crowd's voices were growing louder. Someone was organizing them, turning a mob into something more dangerous. Silas could hear boots on wooden sidewalks, the clink of metal on metal as weapons were checked and readied. "How did you escape?" "Mama hid us in the supply wagon when the shooting started. Told us to stay quiet no matter what." "We heard." Marcus swallowed hard. "We heard everything." The screaming stopped after a while. Then they burned the wagons and rode away. The second girl spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "We walked for 2 days. No food, no water. Then the men found us again. They said they were searching for survivors," Marcus continued. "Said they'd take us somewhere safe. But they brought us here instead. Been locked in the mayor's barn for 3 days while they figured out what to do with us." Silas felt rage building in his chest like steam in a kettle. Murder, robbery, kidnapping, and now human trafficking, all dressed up in legal papers and town ordinances. He'd known corruption before, but this was evil wearing a sheriff's badge and calling itself law. A rock struck one of the stained glass windows, spiderwebbing the colored glass. Then another. The crowd was testing their resolve, seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. "They're going to come for us," Marcus said, stating the obvious with the calm of someone who'd already accepted the worst possible outcome. "Let them come. Silas checked his ammunition. 2 full cylinders, plus the shells on his belt. Enough for a fight, but not enough for a siege. You children stay low. Keep away from the windows. The little girl finally stopped humming and looked up at him with eyes too old for her face. Are you going to die for us, mister? The question hung in the dusty air like incense, heavy with innocence and wisdom combined. Silas looked at her torn doll, at Marcus's scraped knuckles, at all 6 faces marked by violence and loss. I'm going to try not to, he said finally. But if I do, I want you to know it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Outside, Mayor Hatch's voice rose above the crowd. Marshal Brennan. We need to discuss this situation like reasonable men. Surely we can reach an accommodation. Accommodation. The same word he'd used earlier, dripping with false civility and hidden threats. Silas knew what accommodations looked like in places like Millbrook. They looked like shallow graves and bills of sale. The church bell tolled 6 times, each bronze note falling like a hammer blow. Darkness was coming, and with it, the kind of men who did their worst work under cover of night. Marcus moved closer to the window, peering through a crack in the broken glass. There's more of them now. Maybe 60, 70 men. They got torches. Silas joined him at the window. The crowd had indeed grown, and their mood had shifted from uncertain to determined. Someone had been working on them, convincing them that their way of life was under attack. That federal interference threatened everything they'd built in this remote corner of nowhere. They weren't entirely wrong. What Silas represented did threaten their way of life. The question was whether one man with a gun could make that threat real enough to matter. The little girl started humming again, and this time Silas recognized the tune. Amazing Grace. A hymn about salvation and redemption, sung in a church that had forgotten what those words meant. Outside, the torches flickered like fallen stars, and the night pressed closer. Dawn broke over Millbrook like a wound-bleeding light across the desert sky. Silas had spent the night moving between windows, watching torches burn down to embers as the crowd maintained their vigil. The children had slept fitfully on church pews, the youngest still clutching her damaged doll. Marcus sat up as the first rays touched the stained glass, automatically checking on his siblings before looking to Silas. The boy had learned too young that mornings could bring fresh dangers. They're still out there, Silas reported quietly. Fewer now, but they're not leaving. Through the cracked window, he could see maybe 20 men scattered around the church grounds. The rest had gone home to sleep off their whiskey courage, but the core remained. These were the true believers, the ones who'd convinced themselves that murdering families and selling children was just another form of frontier justice. The church door shuddered under heavy fists. Mayor Hatch's voice carried through the oak planks with forced reasonableness that fooled no one. Marshal Brennan. I trust you've had time to consider your position. Surely we can resolve this matter without further complications. Silas checked his ammunition again. 12 rounds left, plus what was in the cylinder. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make his point if it came to shooting. Nothing to resolve, Mayor, he called back. Children stay with me until federal transport arrives. And when might that be? The question came with barely concealed mockery. They both knew no federal transport was coming. Silas had ridden alone, following a warrant for cattle rustling, not expecting to find a town built on murder and human trafficking. When it arrives. A new voice joined the conversation, rougher and less diplomatic than the mayor's political smoothness. Marshal, this is Sheriff Coleman. I'm ordering you to surrender those children to lawful municipal authority. You're interfering with legitimate town business. Silas almost laughed. He'd wondered where the local law was during yesterday's auction. Now he knew. Sheriff Coleman was probably the one who'd organized the wagon train massacre, maybe even pulled the trigger on Jonathan Whitmore. Sheriff, I'm operating under federal authority. Municipal jurisdiction doesn't apply. Federal authority ends where local sovereignty begins. You got no right to hold those children against their legal placement. Legal placement. The same lies wrapped in different words, but the smell of corruption was the same. Silas had seen enough small towns where law was whatever the powerful said it was, where badges were just another form of business license. The little girl tugged at his coat sleeve. "Mister, are you really going to fight all those men for us?" Her question cut deeper than any threat from outside. She was asking why a stranger would risk everything for children who weren't his own, who he'd known for less than a day. It was a fair question. Silas wasn't entirely sure he knew the answer himself. "Because it's right," he said finally, though the words felt inadequate. Marcus joined them at the window. "There's more coming. Looks like they went and got everyone." The crowd was indeed growing again. Silas counted at least 40 men now, some carrying rifles, others with handguns and knives. Mayor Hatch stood in front with Sheriff Coleman, both trying to project authority while staying out of direct line of fire. Behind them, Silas recognized faces from yesterday's auction. The man in the stained apron who'd bid $40 for 6 children's lives. The auctioneer with his gold teeth and legal papers dated yesterday. The shopkeepers and saloon owners who'd gathered to watch innocence sold like livestock. They'd all profited from the blood money. They'd all convinced themselves it was business, nothing personal, just the way things worked in places too remote for civilization's inconvenient morality. "Last chance, Marshal." Sheriff Coleman's voice carried the edge of a man losing patience with negotiation. "Send those children out and ride away. Nobody needs to die over vagrant orphans." Vagrant orphans. As if the Whitmore children were somehow less valuable because their parents had been murdered by the very men demanding their return. Silas stood in the church doorway, morning light streaming past him to illuminate the children arranged behind him like a final photograph. The oldest boy with his jaw set in defiance. The second girl holding her younger sister's hand. The 2 middle boys standing shoulder to shoulder. The youngest with her torn doll and eyes that had seen too much. "These children aren't going anywhere," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the square with the weight of absolute certainty. Mayor Hatch stepped forward, his political mask finally slipping to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Marshal, you're forcing us to take action we'd all prefer to avoid. But this town has invested considerable resources in the proper placement of these orphans. We cannot allow federal interference to undermine legitimate municipal authority." Invested resources. They meant the bribes they'd paid, the officials they'd bought, the system of corruption they'd built to transform murder into profit. Silas represented everything they feared, outside authority that couldn't be purchased or intimidated. "Then you'll have to take them from me," Silas replied. The crowd stirred like a disturbed hive. Men checked their weapons, adjusted their positions, prepared for violence they'd convinced themselves was necessary to protect their way of life. Marcus stepped forward to stand beside Silas, his thin shoulders squared against the morning chill. "I'm not going back to that barn." "Me neither," said the second girl, joining her brother. One by one, all 6 children moved to stand in the doorway behind Silas, forming a line of defiance that should have been heartbreaking but somehow looked like the most natural thing in the world. Sheriff Coleman raised his rifle. "That's far enough. You're all under arrest for resisting lawful authority." Silas drew his Colt, the familiar weight settling into his palm like an old friend returning home. Around the square, 40 men tensed for the fight they'd been building toward since yesterday afternoon. The church bell tolled 7 times, each bronze note hanging in the desert air like a final blessing. Somewhere in that sound, Silas heard his father's voice reading from the Bible on Sunday mornings, talking about shepherds and sheep and the responsibility of the strong to protect the weak. He'd never expected to make his final stand in an abandoned church, defending children he'd known for less than 24 hours. But looking at their faces, seeing their courage in the face of overwhelming odds, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning shadows and illuminating a town square where good and evil faced each other across a distance measured in heartbeats and bullets. And in that perfect, crystalline moment before the shooting started, Silas Brennan discovered something he'd always wondered about himself: when the time came to choose between safety and righteousness, between survival and sacrifice, he knew exactly who he was. The first shot shattered the morning silence like glass breaking in a cathedral, and Marshal Silas Brennan stepped forward into the light, 6 children at his back and justice in his hand. The question that would echo through the desert long after the gunsmoke cleared wasn't whether he'd chosen right or wrong, but whether any of us would have the courage to make the same choice when our moment came.